Hey guys, happy Thursday and welcome back to the channel. I am so happy you have been loving our weight loss series, and I had wanted to put in a whole video on carbohydrates in that series, and then I started working on this and I was like, you know what? I need to turn this into like a little carbohydrate mini series. So this is a spin-off of our fat loss series or weight loss series that we've been doing for the last month, in the month of June. We're gonna start talking a little bit more about carbohydrates and breaking down carbohydrates and reintroduction of carbohydrates, and really just all your questions on carbohydrates are going to be answered over the next couple of weeks. For those of you who are new, my name is Jessica Ash and I'm a functional nutritionist and just a general hormone nerd. I love connecting biological truths and education so that you can understand your body on a deeper level, but then also implement these truths into your daily life so you can have a better quality of life, which is what it's all about. If you like what I talk about in my videos, remember my signature online course, Fully Nourished, is always available at the link in my description box below. And that course is really the signature blueprint to restoring your metabolism and balancing your hormones using nutrition. Really just an expansion on all that we talk about here and on my Instagram. With that being said, let's dive in today's video, which is actually just going to be breaking down some myths on insulin resistance and carbohydrates. I think that with anything, you'll find that I often start series with just breaking down some myths, because I think mindset is really important when we go into creating balance in our body. And if we don't believe in our body and we don't believe our body can achieve something, then that's going to be really holding us back from really fully implementing habits, yes, but also like it's going to hold us back physically, because what's going on mentally totally does affect our nervous system and is going to affect how every single cell in our body functions. And, you know, being in the PCOS space, you guys know I don't like to really characterize or identify myself with PCOS, but I am somebody who has struggled with a lot of symptoms of PCOS, including insulin resistance. And so being in the PCOS space and also coming from a low carb and keto and paleo background, I have been around the block and I've seen a lot of really just poor science being thrown around in regards to insulin resistance. And I know for me personally, I never really understood insulin resistance. I just thought insulin bad, blood sugar bad, carbohydrates bad, and it was as simple as that. And I saw that a lot of people were basing their science on that. And so when I actually started to understand the physiology of the body and really how blood sugar works, I was really just confused as to why all these experts were teaching about insulin as if it's like the worst hormone in the world. Really, like any hormone going unchecked or any hormone that is imbalanced is going to be the worst hormone in the world. But the problem with that is you're blaming a symptom of the problem rather than actually seeing the problem for what it is. And I believe that insulin resistance is just another symptom of a much larger problem, which is a metabolism problem. And so when we start to just focus on like hyper focus, laser focus on just getting our insulin levels down and just like getting our blood sugar down, we're really missing the point as to why it's high in the first place. And this is really where a lot of people do a lot of metabolic damage, because they think that insulin resistance is the root cause, when in reality it's just a symptom of the root cause. So let's dive into the worst 4 myths that are going around all about insulin these days. The first one, which seems simple to me, but I don't think this is very simple to a lot of people, which is eating carbs causes insulin resistance. I wish that this is something that we would see right through the BS and realize that this is not a thing, but people continue to preach that carbohydrates are the thing that causes insulin resistance and is the sole thing that causes insulin resistance. The problem with this philosophy is that insulin being high and resistance to insulin in the cell are 2 separate things. Now, often these 2 things are going to be paired together, but not always. You can have relatively normal levels of insulin and your cells can still not be responding to it. So this is where just people are not understanding that high insulin and insulin resistance are 2 separate things. Your cells are supposed to respond to a hormone called insulin, which acts as kind of like a key to let blood sugar into the cell to then be utilized to create energy called ATP in the mitochondria. And when your body is not responding to insulin well, your body is already starving of sugar. Your body is not getting the glucose that it needs to make energy. So it is actually resorting to its backup system and using free fatty acids a lot of the times. So when people are insulin resistant or are struggling with insulin resistance, they are already not burning glucose well. I do not see why the answer to that is by pulling the fuel source and saying like, oh, well, the insulin levels are back down, so therefore the problem is gone. The problem is not gone. The main problem is that the cells are not using sugar well, and you got to get the cells using sugar well again. And yes, once the cell is not using sugar well, then the body is going to have to produce more and more insulin to get the cells responding to insulin. But is that a carbohydrate problem? No, it's a cell problem. And we need to stop blaming carbohydrates for problems that are happening within the cells, because take away the carbohydrates and the cell problem is still there. Yeah, your insulin might go down a bit, and that might make you feel overall better because insulin being high can cause a lot of issues. But at the end of the day, it doesn't actually fix the cell problem or the metabolic problem. And I actually teach all about this in one of my free trainings called Creating Balance. It's a blood sugar training and it's free to all. The link will be in the description box below. But I really talk about how insulin resistance is really an inconsistency issue, and it's an imbalance. It's a deep imbalance within the body. It's just an expression of deep imbalance within the body, which we often, if you've been around my Instagram page or my YouTube, you know that it always kind of goes back to this, is the body's not really getting what it needs. It has more stressors than it knows how to handle or has the resources to handle. And so therefore it's trying to compensate, and these imbalances are occurring. And so I highly recommend that if you're interested in this topic to take that free training. It's free to all, there's no strings attached, but I think it really will be enlightening for a lot of people who still solely blame carbohydrates for insulin resistance. And I'm not going to deny that, sure, eating too many carbs in one sitting, of course that's going to cause some problems. And doing that one too many times, of course that's going to cause stress on the body. But again, is it really about just the carbs, or is it about the inconsistency, and is it about the overdoing it, and is it about more in our lives than just that particular meal that was high in carbohydrates one too many times? Most likely it's about our patterns and our habits over anything else. The second myth I want to break down really quick is that all carbs are created equal. This is just not true. And it's really interesting, especially in our modern day and age where there are so many processed carbohydrates or manufactured carbohydrates, like for example, high fructose corn syrup, or we have carbohydrates like white bread, where it's like, yeah, there's refined carbohydrates in there, but there's also a bunch of other additives that could be totally affecting our ability to respond to carbohydrates well. So, not all carbs are created equal. And for people who say that, a glass of orange juice is equal to a can of soda, they don't understand the body at all. The body is way smarter than you give it credit for. And to say that the body just sees all things the same, it just is it's an abomination. Let's just put it that way. It's an abomination to my knowledge of physiology, but also it really causes this fear mongering and this fear of carbohydrates. So to simplify really quick, all carbohydrates break down into sugar molecules, aka saccharides, but not all carbohydrates break down into the same types of saccharides. So we have monosaccharides, which just means one saccharide, and that's going to be the classic like glucose and fructose. And so remember that our body runs specifically, or a lot of our cells like to run specifically off of glucose, and fructose is actually taken into things like the liver and can be turned into glucose. So in reality, these are like the simplest sugars that you can intake. Then we have disaccharides, which are combinations of those monosaccharides we just talked about. These are what you're going to find in like table sugar, aka sucrose, which is a combination of glucose and fructose. We have like lactose, which is the sugar found in milk, is a disaccharide. And these are going to be pretty easy to break down, but they do require a break in that bond because they are two sugars put together in a little chain. And then we have our most complex carbohydrates, aka polysaccharides, which are multiple sugars combined together. And you can think of it as like a string of pearls to simplify, to make up a different type of carbohydrate. So the most classic polysaccharides you're familiar with would be like starches and cellulose, which is often found mostly in plant foods. So many plants are going to contain polysaccharides, except for fruits, which often contain the simpler sugars. Now, we need to really get it through our head that simple and complex are not like good or bad. They just are what they are, and they provide different types of sugar for the body in different amounts, in different speeds. And so that's all we have to see these things as. I know with like the glycemic index and all of this information out there, what people will say like, eat more complex carbs, don't eat simple carbs, do this, do this. It can make it seem like one is better than the other, or one is like, healthier than the other, but this is just really not true, and it really just depends on your body. And then we have to remember that additional additives and ingredients are also going to impact the way that our body breaks down these sugars and uses these sugars. So, for example, a bar that has oatmeal in it, we're no longer just dealing with a simple ingredient, aka oatmeal. We're now dealing with a bunch of different ingredients that the body's going to respond to at different speeds and digest and assimilate in different ways. Maybe some of the things in that oat bar are not going to be responded to very well, and so that's going to affect how you digest and respond to the carbs in that oatmeal. And so we have to remember that ingredients and additives in our carbohydrates matter, and then we'll talk about in a moment that the things that we eat with the carbohydrates we consume also matter. And so, all carbs are not created equal. There are different types of carbohydrates from different types of foods, and they are going to impact our bodies very, very differently across the board. So we really do ourselves a disservice when we say that all carbs are bad, or I don't respond to carbs well. Well, what carbs are we talking about? Are we talking about white rice? Are we talking about, an orange? Those are two very separate things. And so we can't lump them all together for the love of our hormones. And we will actually talk about this more in the coming videos. So we'll actually talk a lot more about like the types of carbohydrates and how to combine them, and how different carbohydrates are going to be responded to by different people in a different way. But the third myth I want to actually break down is carbs are the only thing that matters when it comes to insulin resistance. That's the only thing we have to focus on. So a lot of people, when they have insulin resistance, or they're struggling with the use of carbohydrates, or they feel that carbs make them really sluggish, or they just don't feel like they're digesting carbs well, they just hyper focus in on carbs, and they're like, carbs bad, carbs bad, carbs bad, and they just cut the carbs, and then they're like, oh, life is so much better, and it's like, no, we have to ask ourselves the right question. And you guys know I always ask the question, why? Why is the body not responding to carbohydrates well? It's not just about the carbs, right? That is looking at one little tiny piece of the puzzle. We've got to look at the whole puzzle. And one of the big things that I think people are missing, especially nowadays, is the types of fats we consume with our carbs, and the amounts of fats we consume with our carbs totally matters, and it totally impacts how our body responds to the carbohydrates in our meal. Remember that fats don't only slow digestion, but they also do get broken down and go into the bloodstream as well. And when there's a lot of free fatty acids present in the bloodstream, the body now has two different fuel sources to burn. It doesn't only have glucose, it now has free fatty acids. And so oftentimes, if the body is already not responding to glucose well, it's going to actually not respond to insulin and not take up blood glucose and actually start using those free fatty acids. Many times people with damaged metabolisms are already using a bunch of free fatty acids. They already kind of revert to their backup system. And so the blood glucose is going to remain in the bloodstream, as is the insulin. And here we have these high glucose levels and these high insulin levels. The body's already burning free fatty acids. And so oftentimes people make the mistakes of adding in more fat into their diet, or they're doing like high fat meals. I see a lot of like PCOS pages and people saying like, always pair a ton of fat with your carb. And yes, you need to find a good balance of protein, carb, and fat for your meals and find what works for you. But more fat is not better and can actually make insulin resistance or symptoms of insulin resistance worse depending on the meal. So that can be like a meal by meal basis. So if you're doing a high carbohydrate meal, or a meal that has a good amount of carbohydrates, it's probably a good idea to only have a moderate amount of fat. And I think that's a good practice for most people. Most people don't need to be on a high fat diet. And when you are on a high fat diet, it will impact how you use carbohydrates. So just remember, not only the amount of fats matters, but also the types of fats. Those polyunsaturated fatty acids, those ones that are a little bit more susceptible to oxidizing, in heat and light. they're going to cause a different reaction in the body and a different ability to use carbohydrates than saturated fats. But no matter the type of fat, if you're doing too much fat at a meal, that will definitely impact the way that you use glucose. No matter how high quality the fat, no matter if it's butter or coconut oil or whatever, it still can impact your ability to use carbohydrates or tolerate carbohydrates. So just be cautious about, your body's needs when it comes to the fat combined with your carbs and protein. And then the last myth I want to really break down, and again, we'll expand on these a lot more in the coming weeks, but that myth is all protein is created equal. A lot of us know that when we have insulin resistance or we have problems with carbs, we need to be getting enough protein at each meal and combining protein with carbohydrates, right? Protein really works to lower blood sugar and carbohydrates work to raise blood sugar. But the problem is not all protein is created equal. And a lot of people are treating protein equal. And what I mean by this is they're treating plant proteins as the same as animal proteins. And these are just not the same thing, because animal proteins are very specifically unique in that they are often very high in protein, but they don't really have a lot of carbs or starches or anything that impairs your body's ability to digest them. Another thing you have to remember is a lot of animal foods digest very high up in the digestive tract, very high up in the small intestine. They do not ferment, they do not pass through undigested. They often get digested very quickly if our enzyme production is really good. And so when it comes to plants and plant proteins, oftentimes there are a lot of components in plants, especially like we just talked about, the polysaccharides, the starches, and the cellulose that is in plants, amongst a lot of other things like anti-nutrients and natural plant pesticides that really need to make it a long way through our digestive tract to get digested. And some of the components don't even get digested by us, they get digested by our bacteria in our colon or our large intestine. And so this is less of a problem for concentrated plant proteins, but oftentimes people don't realize that even these are very hard to break down and require a really robust enzyme production. And so you might not actually be getting the amount of protein you think you're getting when you're consuming a plant protein, and it's having an impact on your blood sugar. And so when I say get enough protein throughout the series, I'm talking about those bioavailable animal proteins. And I know this is hard to hear, especially if you're somebody that really, is more drawn to a plant-based style of eating. But at the end of the day, like, animal proteins and plant proteins are just not the same. They're not digested the same. They're not absorbed the same. They're not assimilated the same. And it can have a huge impact on overall blood sugar and your ability to really respond to insulin as well. So just keep that in mind. So when it comes to these myths, I want you to kind of remember, insulin resistance is not caused by carbohydrates. We need to stop demonizing them. We need to stop blaming them. And we need to actually start to work to understand our physiology and understand carbohydrates and how they work. Number 2, we need to stop lumping all carbs together. And even like using this overall word carbohydrates, we're using it for simplicity, but really like not all carbohydrates are the same, and many carbohydrates respond so differently in the body. So stop lumping all carbs together. The third thing is remember that carbs are not the only thing that matters when you are struggling with blood sugar issues or even insulin resistance. You need to see everything as a whole. And this goes for not just the fats we're consuming, not just the protein that we're consuming, but even our lifestyle can impact our ability to respond to carbohydrates well. So just keep that in mind, that carbs are not the only thing to focus on, and we got to zoom out instead of be hyper focused on one thing. And then lastly, remember that not all proteins are created equal, and animal proteins and plant proteins are two very separate things, and the body responds to them in two very separate ways. So keep that in mind when you're trying to create balance within your body. These are all concepts that I teach in my online course, Fully Nourished. And so if you're a Fully Nourished student, I know this is not new to you, but I do want to expand on carbohydrates for all of my followers, and especially you YouTube subscribers who really are loving digging in deep and figuring out where your imbalances lie. Make sure that if you haven't already, to download my free Creating Balanced Blood Sugar training. I think you'll really enjoy it, and it really talks about how imbalances over time become bigger and bigger imbalances. And I think you'll find it very fascinating as to how maybe something that started 7 years ago or 10 years ago has kind of snowballed into where you're at today, and how, it is a slow and steady wins the race type of mentality to get back to where we want to go. But I'll see you in the next video where we're actually gonna go over finding our carb tolerance. And for those of you who are maybe on the journey to reintroducing carbs or are trying to reintroduce carbs, we're gonna talk about how to reintroduce carbohydrates properly. So I'll see you there.